Well, good day, everyone, and welcome to this FS Club webinar. It's a special webinar for me in many ways because it's a topic I've long wanted to cover for over a decade. Somebody approached me once and said to me, did I understand really what the religions of the book meant? And so today we've managed to bag an expert here. So Abbas Razawi is dialing in from Glasgow, and he's going to be covering the topic in great depth. Can the religions of the book teach modern finance? And I asked him just to put down there at the bottom with a little bit of a look at usury and the history of Abrahamic lending. Now, you'll know me, Michael Mainelli. I'm one of the directors of Zien, and it's my privilege to be able to introduce many of these webinars. These webinars are really only possible thanks to our sponsors who let us range widely and freely across technology, economics, and finance. And I would take my hats off to all of them for allowing us to cover subjects that we think will be of interest to our audience. Today, we're going to be looking very, very much at the role of finance, as I said, and the religious books. Syed is not coming here solely with an Islamic perspective, but with the three faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And in the course of looking at this, it's really going back to sort of an idea that one could take that the Bible, the Old Testament, the Abrahamic tradition is really almost an instruction manual, a user manual, if you will, for running a society circa 5th or 6th century BC. And that we can discern from this in many ways some basic underlying rules for finance, whether you're religious or not. Although if you are religious, then it assumes even more importance. Now, my job is, of course, to get out of the way. Your job is to sit back and learn and then to start formulating some questions and comments. Please use the GoToWebinar chat facility because if you email me, I will only get it afterwards. I'm here with Saeed and you. Feed them in and I'll put them into the conversation in the 10 minutes that we've got budgeted for questions. So Saeed, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Michael. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. And I guess with the time limit, the pressure is now on to really go through a journey on can the religions of the book teach modern finance, or what can they teach modern finance? So with that, I'd say that there are three things that I'm going to cover. I guess firstly is that what is the religions of the book? What is the historical narrative? And then from there, we'll go into a small case study on what Islam was in its interaction with Judaism and Christianity, and then finally ending on usury. So let's start on there. What are the people of the book? So what is the religions of the book? Religions of the book really take their origin from Abraham. Abraham, as he's known, Abraham later on as the interpretation essentially means father of many nations. So today, the children of Israel take Abraham as their ancestral father. Christianity is both ancestor and a spiritual father. And for the Muslim community, or at least for the children of Ishmael and the Arabs, he is also their biological and spiritual father. And I guess the term religion is something which is quite Western. It's developed by the Greeks and then later on the Romans. There's three fundamental qualities, or you could say quiddity, as we say in philosophy, that defines religion. The first thing, that it has a dogma. And you find that many Eastern traditions and their traditions and metaphysics, they may not have a firm dogma or a theology that children of Abraham or the Abrahamic faiths may have. The second thing is that they also definingly have a moral structure. And it's quite an in-depth moral structure, and it's based on virtue ethics, Abrahamic virtue ethics, and that's something which is a chain amongst all three of these religions. And then finally, and again importantly, they have rites, rituals, practices, and the idea of finance will come into that. So next slide, please. So I guess business, commerce, trade, finance is about as old as religion itself. Though we have discussion as to where the first Homo sapiens came, was it in Africa or was it elsewhere, is the older civilization and high religion found in Indus Valley, the Shang culture in the valley of the Yellow River, or is it Egyptian culture in the Nile Delta? Well, effectively, the first society or civilization actually comes around in southern Mesopotamia, which is modern-day Iraq. And what you find in the city of Sumeria was that it became a hub for multiple different things: the creation of the wheel, the wagon, writing, and potentially the oldest system of calculations used in the temple. And this is when we find that temple economy begins. So first, trade, business really begins from the temple. So here you find that religion and trade is interlinked. Here begins trade. Thank you. Next slide, please. And immediately what follows is the following. So the 11 things that I've actually written here, noted on these slides. And for those people who know their Bible, you'll know that Babylon was destroyed more than one time by divine punishment because of inappropriate trading. And so the first thing was fraud, bribery, gifts, lying, cheating, price gouging, inappropriate products, and later on political involvement, discrimination, and much later on issues surrounding employee compensation, human exploitation, and much recently tax evasion. So what you find is that a whole host of vices begin. And because of this, you find that the Bible is interlinked with trade many a time. And you find historically that God did bring down wraths and punishments on certain communities, either because they were cheating, either because they were unethical in their trade. And so immediately what we find is that there needs to be some kind of a moral compass. God takes this very seriously. And so what happens is that something does develop. Next slide, please. Here the role of religion begins. Now, what is the role of religion essentially? It's really to provide a roadmap for human beings. What does it give us? It's meant to give us happiness. It brings light into our life, takes away pain and suffering, takes us towards goodness. And when goodness comes into our lives, essentially pain and suffering is meant to stop. And as you know, that since the fall of Adam, at least in the biblical sense, when Adam moves away from the source of goodness, humanity then begins to suffer. And so really it's a roadmap. It's a map back to the light, back to God, back to the divine. But the one thing is this, that religion is not divorced from the physical world either. That though one finds that religion technically deals with the hereafter and the soul, but actually there's no bifurcation. The soul and the physical body are interlinked. They're at unity, at least in the physical world. And so therefore we've got to cater for that physical body, that material body. And the biggest part of our daily life really is our interactions. And a huge chunk of that comes with business and trade. So if I take the example of Islam, by extension, the Abrahamic religions or the people of the books are monotheists. And if we go to the Quran, and actually this is a point that was pointed out to me by a very close Sephardi friend of mine. I don't think he'd mind if I mention him, Edwin Shukar. It's his intellectual property. It's the vice president of the board of deputies, where he said, look, have you actually looked into the Quran? The Quran talks about religion, doesn't talk about religions. It talks about Islam, and Islam meaning monotheism. Abraham was a Muslim, not in the sense that we recognize Islam today. So he says, you guys have capitalized on the term Islam. In fact, monotheism is also part of Judaism and Christianity as well. So you've got the Isawi monotheism or Islam, or you've got the kind of Musawi, Mosaic Islam. So anyhow, the extension of which meant that living monotheism is also being at the state of unity when it comes to the physical world. So one has to be ethical within business to be a true monotheist. Next slide, please. So now then what happens? What can religion give? And again, we're still on the introduction, so I'm going to go very fast, bearing in mind that we've got a shortage in terms of time. I guess the first thing religion provides is a methodology. And this methodology is a holistic one. So it deals with the core, goes into the core of things. It's not something which overnight there's going to be a solution. It's a holistic movement that goes from the core of humanity and outward. So really, let's say, for example, if we took these principles and we applied them, I'm going to get to the principles in a minute, but let's say if we were to apply these principles, what do they give? Structures and mechanisms for equitable trading that benefit not just the individual, but one has to remember the individual is linked to corporations, and the corporations are linked to society, and the society is linked to governments. So essentially, we're raising the standard of living and well-being of all of the communities and societies. That is what the aim of ethical business is, to raise so there's no disparity. Look, I'll take you back to a survey that was done by the University of Maryland, where they concluded that modern society can collapse if two things become prevalent, which are becoming prevalent. The two things: one is the environmental crisis. If that deepens, you'll find that it will have an impact on society. But the second thing is disparity in wealth. Rich are getting richer, poor are getting poorer. We've got to bridge this for our survival. In fact, as long as we're able to do that, they concluded that we can maintain social norms, peace within our society. But anyhow, to move forward. So therefore, what does religion then do? Religion can provide spirituality, which enhances the values and practices in corporate culture. So in the same way we have, for example, residentials where corporate leaders can go and develop their leadership skills, religion also proposes that there should be somewhere where we can look at spirituality, ethics, and virtue. And with that, what does it do? It may strengthen existing principles and values. Spirituality can, in fact, play a greater role to differentiate between practices and values. But what religion does is it gives universal principles. The Abrahamic religions are based on virtue ethics. And virtue is something which is found in all of humanity. Next slide, please. Now, what Kant says is that, look, moral actions must conform to universal principles. And virtue ethics does exactly that. Good is good. Compassion is compassion. Kindness is something which is universal. To love thy neighbor is something which is universal. Virtue, therefore, is found in all human beings. Whether we believe it or not, lying is a bad thing. If you take a 3-year-old child, be it in Shanghai or in Baghdad or in New York or in London, and you ask him, is lying bad? Lying is bad. Cheating is bad. Hurting someone is bad. And this is why Abraham was as a genius. This virtue ethics of his, that is also adopted by the Greeks, by the way, is something which can be implemented all over the world. And this is why it works. So for business, I think it's very important. And if you go to the UN compacts, those 10 principles, actually I find that those universal principles are based upon virtue ethics. And the best, I find, format that we have today is that UN compact, but we can look at it later. So anyway, moving very quickly forward, I find that what spirituality therefore can do is it can change the vision of a particular manager or a CEO or a director, enhance the humanity, and at the same time also develop teams which can hold accountable stakeholders. And when that happens, remember, we've got a covenantal responsibility. What religion teaches us is covenantal responsibility is above and beyond contracts. Contracts can be broken, circumvented. But if you look at the concept of covenants within religion, at least, not in the legal sense, but in the religious sense, it's a moral responsibility that two people or more than two people have coming from within their practices. So therefore, corporations have a responsibility as part of society to society itself. Next slide, please. Now look, there's a threefold principle that religion teaches. God is the ultimate source, so we're answerable to God. Centrality of the community, of which society is part of. Societies build civilizations. And there's an entire society of traders and business. And so what's important, therefore, is that we work as part of that community. Thirdly, this work that we do needs to transform the standard of living of the whole, to raise the standard of living, to raise society, peace, well-being, and all of these catchwords that we're using today is what the aim of business essentially needs to be, at least on a religious perspective. And therefore, business does have a responsibility to society. And when it improves this image, when it starts becoming more ethical, what happens is that it's good PR for business. Next slide, please. Remember, society allows for business to take place. If society became rebellious, it would change the fabrics of the way we do business. And you've seen this with the USSR, how a capitalist on the one side, we've got a capitalist system, on a communist system collapsed. Why? When the people, and of course there are multiple other factors, but it's people who change economic structures. And so one must remember that we are answerable to society. Next slide, please. So the immediate principles that we get from the Abrahamic faiths. Now, if we go into Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and we were to pull together fundamental immediate principles, what would they be? The first is this: legal directives and moral imperatives needs to be integrated into any system. Mechanisms to avoid fraud, and there's multiple traditions on this. Be it if you go into the Talmud or the Mishnah, if you come to Christianity as well, look at some of the edicts that have been given by the Roman Catholic Church over the last 1500 years. Or, for example, when you come into the corpus of law or Sharia within Islam, you find much of it is to do with avoiding fraud, protecting communities from harm, and at the same time, perhaps to develop a body which can hold accountable. And I think that's important, the business community. Next slide, please. So now, with that, let's look at a case study, and let's look at Islam itself. I know that in the next 2 lectures which are coming, we'll have specialists from the Jewish community and the Christian community, and they'll be able to address both Judaism and Christianity respectively. But let's very quickly look at Islam. What can Islam contribute? Well, let's look at the case study. What was Islam? How was Islam? Well, the Islamic civilization, at least in the medieval period, was by far and away the most advanced civilization. In fact, one could say that after the collapse of the Roman Empire, the most advanced civilization was the Islamic civilization that we've seen in the last 2,000 years. If you look at the spread of Islam within 50 years of the death of the Prophet Muhammad, you found that a civilization develops which houses 7 cultures, from the tips of Spain all the way to the tips of China. A bank note, you could say, or a financial guarantee in Baghdad was valid in Shanghai. Why is that? Or, for example, you look at Andalusia, southern Spain, the development of technology, sciences, the arts. And essentially, at least for 300 years, wherever Islam spread, it developed hubs, both economic, educational, social hubs, which is really different from imperialism and the collapse of imperialism, whereby you saw that there was a drain of resources and potentially the world is where it is today because of that. I guess the only success that took place is the empowerment of North America. But aside from that, if you look at Africa and Asia today, what once were vibrant communities are where they are today. Well, what the Islamic Empire was able to do actually was 2 things. First is, one must remember, by the way, that Islam developed from a mercantile culture. The Prophet Muhammad is the only founder of a faith or a religion that actually worked for his wife, and secondly was a mercantile prophet. He was a trader. And so trading was integrated within the faith as part of worship. If you're a good trader, you're a good worshipper of God. You're holy. And the idea of a mercantile saint came from there. And yes, there were people who were more Sufi inclined, who were going into caves and meditating and so forth. But also you had those people who went out to trade. And it was believed that you could be enlightened through trade. And remember, this is that civilization that brought about the Silk Road, the Golden Web from Asia to Western Europe. And it was the only civilization, or you could say the only empire within medieval period, that there was no feudal system. And the reason being is this: distribution of wealth. And when we talked about the disparity of wealth between rich and poor, Islam came to bridge it together. And we'll see how in a minute. Next slide, please. So really Sharia, and I know there's a lot of misconceptions, Sharia basically equates today to what halakhic law would be. Divided into two things, Sharia. The first is your responsibility to God, prayers, fasting, pilgrimage. But the second is interactions, contracts, and there are 18 books. Financial transactions, mortgages, bankruptcies, inability to owe one's debt, guaranteed drafts, compromise partnerships, renting, borrowing, agency, gifts, charitable endowments, loaning, etc., etc. Farming is it's a huge one, especially within 1400 years ago within the Arab world. So what you find is that half of Sharia actually deals with, or more than half, but yeah, two sections. Half of it would essentially deal with interactions, finance, trade, bilateral contracts. And so it's really quite in depth. And again, I guess the fallacy is that Sharia laws, it's about law itself, cutting hands and all sorts of things. That's nothing to do with Sharia law, by the way. Actually, Sharia law is only two things. It's worship, laws around that, and then business responsibilities, interactions. But you know what? It doesn't deal with the morality of it. It only deals with the legal side of it. So now let's very quickly look at the morality of it. Next slide, please. Here's some principles that come forward. So when the Prophet came forward, he said, look, to be a merchant is a very good thing. It's an honorable calling. And from that, quickly what developed are the following things: zakat, sadaqah, and other forms of charity. In fact, even before God introduces worship in the Quran, what you have is you have chapters which are dealing, or at least verses which are dealing with corrupt trading. And it's above and beyond worship itself. So firstly, the idea of the Quran is let's be a good human being. Let's overcome deceit, lying, overcharging, poor quality goods. And this is where I guess within the Arab world, the baker's dozen comes along. The idea that you give a little bit more, but to make sure that you're fulfilling your principles to God. And there's quite a remarkable story whereby the Prophet one day is walking through the city of Medina. Medina itself, by the way, means a city. And as he goes there, he sees somebody selling wheat. And the wheat looks amazing on the top. When he puts his hand down and he pulls it out, he finds that there's wet wheat. And so he turns around and he says, why didn't you put this on the top? Don't you know a person who deceives is not from us? And so you're not a good Muslim if you're deceiving. Next slide, please. So from there, certain principles come forward. To maintain, I guess, legitimacy, moral legitimacy, Islam develops this idea of distribution of wealth. The zakat, or even the khums, so you've got levies on minerals, other forms of levies, religious levies, on income, on cattle, camels, wheat, and so forth. The idea is that portions of your wealth are given to maintain a distribution of wealth. Social, one could say, institutions are developed. The waqf is very important. I'll give you an example. Ottoman Istanbul, let's say, 1/3 of the city was waqf. What is waqf? Waqf is from a portion of your wealth. You give a particular amount of money for the orphans, for the widowers, for, let's say, education, and so forth. All of the charitable causes were independent of the government itself. And so therefore there was a responsibility on the people to develop institutions, one of them being the waqf, to help charitable causes. And that came from the wealth of businesses. Next slide, please. And this is where you have the concept of the trades house. Though I've got my Edinburgh pin on, but to give you an example of the Glasgow trades house, let's say you're, as I am, let's say, a member of the Incorporation of Bakers. Now, let's say, for example, and this is actually a case study that we find within history. Let's say I was living in Bosnia. Let's say I'm not living in Glasgow. Let's say I'm living in Bosnia now within the Islamic trades house system. Let's say, for example, a person from the outside comes. Let's say an outsider comes. He comes and he wants to buy my bread, and I give him 12 loaves of bread, and I've overcharged him. And now he goes back to the deacon convener and he says, by the way, look, I've been overcharged. The deacon convener, in all of his pomp, would come into my shop, take a silk blue square, put it on my goods, and leave my door open. Therefore, that means that nobody will trade with me, and I'd be very embarrassed until the deacon convener comes a week later to say, repent, and now you can carry on with business. The idea was that, for example, the guild or the trades house was a check and balance on businesses, and it was empowered, and it had more responsibilities, one would say, than actually the government itself. Next slide, please. So now quickly coming on to the idea of usury. And look, I know none of these topics can be given justice in 25 minutes, and I'm about to go over time, so I'm going to go very quickly. Why is usury condemned within religion? Well, here's a working definition of it. A practice of making unethical or immoral monetary loans that unfairly enrich the lender. And the second thing really is, why was usury condemned for? Because they were taking advantage of people who are unfortunate or misfortunate of society. Next slide, please. So here we have two quotes, and there's more than two quotes found in the Old Testament and the Torah, which forbid usury and interest. And I'll link it all together. Next slide, please. Here's in Christianity. And again, within Christianity, both usury and interest is forbidden. The First Council of Nicaea, again, forbids clergy from taking it. Later on, this is extended to the laity. And then you have the Latin III, and then after that, the Fifth Council in the 16th century, which again bans usury for all intents and purposes. Next slide, please. And here two verses from the Koran, which also forbid usury and interest. Next slide, please. Now, before I go any further, I'm just going to bring all of them together. What we find in the Abrahamic traditions is that usury was not something which was tolerated. Interest was not tolerated. So, for example, within Judaism, amongst Jews, you weren't able to charge interest. The same thing we find within medieval Christianity and actually Islam itself. I think there's a bit of a misconception within Islam. Yes, interest is not allowed for multiple reasons, and one of them being that it takes advantage of those people who are disadvantaged. So essentially where usury came in was in the chapter of charity. Now, amongst Muslims, it's not allowed. It's the same principle within Judaism. The reason why it was extended further to Jews and Christians is because very pragmatically, when you're living, and Islam, I guess, from the three religions, is the only one of them within 50 years had an empire. So you had Jews and you had Christians and Muslims living side by side. So those Jews and Christians who were living in peace with Muslims, it was forbidden for Muslims to charge them interest. But interest could be charged to those people who are warring with Islam. And this is why today, I guess, it's a gray area, especially within Islamic finance. And there may be multiple ways of changing words, semantical discussions, that certain Orthodox Muslims may say that Islamic finance is only a guise for semantic discussion, and some may live by it. But really, we're not here to discuss Islamic finance, but the one thing I will say is this. These are the principles from usury and the reason why usury was forbidden. Because it did away, in many ways, with liability of damage. So within the jurisprudence, within Sharia, liability of damage, avoidance of disadvantage has priority over benefits. Contracts are based upon intention, and one cannot cooperate within sinful ventures. Next slide, please. Now, bearing all of this in mind, the onus really goes back to healthy trading. As they say, the customer is always right. One must take care of the customer. But to be able to do this, we have to go to the core. Once you change the core, once you change the culture of trading, only then can you get equitable trading. So by changing the culture of trading within Mecca, what the Prophet really did was, he said, look, the source of all material gain is God, and we're answerable to God. And then from then onwards, he tried to preach, one would say, or change the social responsibilities to an equitable endeavor from amongst the business community. By doing this, what he did was he implemented virtue ethics, the principles of virtue. Therefore, there needs to be mechanisms and checks and balances, and later on the guild or the trades house developed within the Islamic world just for that. It was running parallel with the government because responsibility is on the person, not just on the governments. or the government or the local councils. It has to come from inside. So each individual who was a member of the guild was responsible for each other, was responsible to keep these high moral standards. And finally, the utmost importance was education, because without education, one cannot change redundant attitudes. So here it was. Islam then became a mercantile religion. The Quran talks in the language of trade, and the idea was honest trade, give more. As the Prophet says, the vice for trade is fraud, try and prevent fraud, deception, and lying, and build a holistic society that we can bridge gaps between the rich and the poor, so that one finds, look at the Islamic civilization lasted for 400 to 500 years. Question is this: is what was developed after World War II going to survive for 500 years? Well, the only way, as people of faith see it, is if we can bridge that gap between rich and poor, distribution of wealth. It doesn't mean you can't be rich. It's good to be rich. And if you look at our faiths, the Abrahamic faiths, they do value people who have done well economically, but at the same time, the virtue is in giving to help others come to a particular standard. Thank you very much. That's my race finished. I'll hand it back to my
Syed, that was magnificent. We gave you, frankly, an impossible mountain to climb to get so much through, and you did such an excellent job with great clarity. It's appreciated. I was also particularly struck. You reminded me very forcefully that it's a mercantile basis, and I hadn't quite grasped that behind Islam. And, the role of the Prophet in trade. So that was one thing, and of course the tolerance of the system for trading around the community. So we could go on about the millet system of the Ottoman Empire, for example, or things like that. So it's very good to get that sweep of history in here. I was also reminded, and this will lead to our first question from Liz Thrussell. As you raised the baker's dozen, which is 13, I've often said that a banker's dozen is 11. So Liz Thrussell would like to ask, are negative interest rates allowable in Islam?
Yes, but I guess, so let me go back to a tradition of the Prophet. The Prophet always has said that, look, when you give a loan to somebody, when a person returns it, make sure you give a bit extra. So there is emphasis on giving extra. The issue comes in fixing that extra.
Okay.
So in that sense, negative loans or negative interest would be okay.
Another question here, which is from Hugh Purser. What role or influence do concepts of risk play in today's discussion? As you know, I mean, really since Descartes in the 1600s, we've seen this increasing emphasis in the West that finance and commerce are about risk, volatility reduction, and increased certainty. Does that play a part in your discussions on the role of finance?
Yes, it does. And, I think, look, we're not divorced from what's taking place in the West. I think the development in the Islamic world of finance at the moment is running parallel with the Western structures of finance. So all of the conversations that you're having, let's say in London or New York, will be found in Dubai or Riyadh or Tehran. So I guess it's exactly the same principles. And what we're trying to do is really, and I guess I would say that it's a cop-out on the basis of religion. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to Islamize the current concepts at the moment. And I think Islam does have a rich heritage that it can offer. I think places of checks and balance for the current system.
Kirshan Ahmed says, thank you for your excellent presentation. I think we've resolved the issue of ethics in business, I think in the West, by creating the term shareholder values and the business practices that have followed from it. Perhaps shareholder values have a good ethical grounding after all?
The UN Global Compact, I find that quite all-encompassing. Those 10 principles, and those people have signed up to that. I find that it's more encompassing. So what you're looking at is anywhere from the environment to fraud to, let's say, for example, child slavery to forced labor. So I do find that quite impressive as something which is holistic and based upon Abrahamic values.
One of our listeners, Alex, makes the comment that many economists have cited figures from the Islamic world as sources of inspiration for their theories and commentaries. And he gives us the example, the economist Arthur Laffer himself cited Ibn Khaldun and Ali ibn Abi Talib as helping him devise his prominent theory, the Laffer curve, which you may remember from the Reagan era. How much of an impact do you, Imam Razawi, believe that the teachings of Islamic figures have had on the study of finance and economics today?
So I think that the foundations for the development in Europe actually comes from the Islamic world. And one has to remember that it's not just Muslims developing this. These are Jews, Christians, and Muslims in Cairo, in Aleppo, in Baghdad, sitting together and developing a system. So I think that there are two ports historically where this will seep through. One is South Spain and the other one's Venice. And traditionally, these were two ports where both education, technology, and finance came through. So yes, I do believe that the people of the books have contributed. And here when I say the Islamic civilization, I'm not talking about just Islam. One has to remember that the Islamic civilization that developed is a product of Jews, Christians, and Muslims sitting together and developing this. So it's not one particular religion, but it's actually threefold religions which came together. And my belief would be that the foundations for the modern Western world actually came from that.
Yeah, I read an interesting book recently, The Merchant of Syria, where the author, she writes about these constant links over hundreds of years that we seem to forget in the modern world, as if the modern geographical boundaries dominated. Mihalis Kantai would like to ask a question. What can the modern banking system learn and apply from the principles of the holy books? Or I might add, perhaps, how might you critique the modern banking system given the principles that you've laid out here?
I think that's a huge chapter in and of itself, but I would say that if we go into, let's say, both Jewish law and halakhic law, principles which are found there and principles which are found within Sharia, as I said, there's 18 books. If we were to open up those books, I think one of the questions, or the questioners mentioned Ali ibn Abi Talib. Ali ibn Abi Talib himself has an entire sermon where he addresses, at least part of it addresses the whole financial system. So it's very difficult to answer that question because it's quite a long question. But I think that within the 18 books found within Sharia, dealing from mortgage anywhere to interest, there are fundamental principles there which can be applied to safeguard both the taker and the giver, so to speak. So if we take business as a bilateral contract, both parties are protected within these 18 books, depending on which transaction it is. But for that, it's really out above and beyond my pay grade. It would have to be a kind of like an in-depth discussion and going into each one of those books. It will take 18 hours to look at each one of those principles.
True. Lasse Instefjord Alsvag is dialing in, I believe, from Norway, and is asking, in the same way as we have challenges with aggregation of wealth in Western countries, I've seen large numbers of palaces when I've traveled in Islamic countries. What challenges do modern Islamic states face today in regards to implementation of the economic laws within the Quran? And he notes, I would assume that the answer would also apply to Western countries.
I'm going to say something very controversial. The Islamic countries are not Islamic countries, but they're secular countries essentially that follow Islam as a majority religion. There is no country at this moment in time in the world that actually follows Islamic principles as well. So I think that's one thing. So when you see all of these palaces and so forth, some of them are kingdoms, others are republics. There's no country in the world today that is following 100% Islamic principles. They happen to be majority Islamic countries. So that's the first thing. If we were to follow an Islamic system, let's say, there would be a huge proportion of wealth. And when I say huge proportion, up to 20%, let's say, of wealth, which would be used for charitable causes. And when I mentioned the whole system of the waqf, the idea that was that this waqf would eat away at particular capital and then distribute it fairly amongst the people. So I don't think that there is any country at the moment which is applying Islamic principles to a T. And because of that, you are seeing disparity in wealth. And because of that, you're seeing poverty. When you're finding people, let's say, for example, in a country like Pakistan, who are trying to avoid the zakat, And again, I'm singling out Pakistan only because it's mandatory that it's deducted from the banks. And of course, this can be applied across the board in all countries, Islamic countries. So I think that at the moment, the Islamic principles are not being followed. I believe that if those principles may be followed, and there is a better distribution of wealth, potentially we could have the same thing that we saw maybe 1,000 years ago in the Islamic world, with technological, educational, scientific progress, which unfortunately we're not seeing today.
Yes, I mean, you very nicely opened with the point about inequality and the environment being the two big challenges facing us. We probably ought to have you on to talk about Islamic principles behind the environment. But I think what I found interesting there is that many of the Christian concepts revolve around pity, as opposed to a structured distribution. You're helping the individual. You're not trying to do it in a systemic way. And this seems more thought through. Victoria Ward asks, I guess, frankly, the question that's on all of our minds. In a secular society, how can we help organizations make space for the ineffable at the heart of faith that goes beyond normal assumptions about social responsibility?
No, that's a very good question. And, even within a secular society, there is place for spirituality. And just because, so let's say, for example, there's multiple different types of secularisms. There's political secularism, there's economic secularism, there's social secularism, and then these have different shades to it. But then in no shape or form means that there's no place for spirituality. And if we were to take a religion as something very personal, the purpose of spirituality is to do what really? Is to take care of the well-being of the person and society. So I do believe that, now, if I use the term spirituality and less religion, spirituality does play a part to provide holistic solutions for individuals to enhance their principles, and those, especially those virtuous principles found within business, and to also provide, one would say, a moral obligation for those principles and virtues to be fulfilled. So when you look at things like social responsibility, let's say, social responsibility, if you're coming from a position or a metaphysical position, that therefore what you're really saying is not just the fact that I have a responsibility, but I have a responsibility to God to take care of other people as well. And if we were to, in fact, even remove God from the equation and just look at it holistically in terms of spirituality, I think through meditative principles that we find, the most important thing I feel is the idea of giving, sharing. These are Kabbalistic principles, these are Sufi principles, these are principles found within the Vedas. If you want peace of mind, if you want society to run smoothly, become like God. What does God do? The ability to share, the ability to give unconditionally. Now, okay, this term unconditional may be quite an issue with some people, but the idea is, let's substitute the term unconditional for fairness. And slowly what you find is that we can find mechanisms whereby from the core, let's say business leaders, to be able to train them in ethics and virtue, which will give them peace holistically, be it through the process of meditation, or otherwise it has a knock-on effect to workers, to the corporate world, to the business, finance, commerce, etc., society and government at large.
It's amazing, because I read a paper recently about 3-4 years ago by Henderson and Romana in the Harvard Business Review, and they were trying to tackle the ethical question in a secular way, and they came back to the principle that you touched on very early on about the obligation to the community. Broadly, their argument was that managers have an obligation to the community to make the market function, because that's the tool, and without that, they don't have any right to exist. And I think that goes back to your bit. It's about trade. It's about mutual benefit. It's about the community. It's much more about commerce, the common community, as opposed to making money. And I think these are very inspiring thoughts. I'd like to close, if I could, with a final question from one viewer in the audience. That's me. About innovation. I saw the most amazing thing the other day. I've been long a proponent of policy performance bonds, where the interest is tied to the outcome. And I saw an astonishing initiative in Malaysia. It's actually a sukuk led to a company called Khazanah, and they are being paid basically on the attainment of of educational goals in schools and universities. I just thought that was just the most wonderful, innovative thing. Are you seeing a lot of innovation in this space?
Not as much as they should be. And as you can see, that type of innovation is very much in line with the Abrahamic faiths. Mm-hmm. So I think if we have more projects, and in fact there are a number of projects in the business city today to mentor, in and of itself, to mentor youth who are coming up, to give them an opportunity, to give opportunity to entrepreneurs. And entrepreneurship is something very big within the Abrahamic faiths, at least within the Islamic mold. It's very important to nurture them to become good human beings and good business people. I think is very important. So I think you've hit the nail on the head there. I think the example that you've given very much fits into the whole virtue ethics. And again, the virtue ethics is also found within secular ethics as well. Yes. There is a chapter within secular virtue ethics. So I guess that's where the synthesis can come. If there needs to be a bridge, I think that's the bridge, virtue ethics.
So I wish we had more time, but we can take more time. So we'd love to have you back if we possibly could. I've got a number of people who want to be put in touch with you. I love the answer to my questions. Excellent and thought-provoking, fascinating talk, fascinating, inspiring. I won't give you too much praise or you'll be blushing out there. If you could give me just a moment, I need to give, if I can, 3 quick rounds of thanks. My first round of thanks again to our sponsors. I hope you found this as inspiring as the audience has, and that it bodes well for all of us that we're living in a society that has discussions about how to improve the shape of our commercial world, whether you're a believer or a non-believer. Nevertheless, the principles, the virtue ethics underpin all of that. The second thing I would like to thank are, of course, the audience. You've been very, very fantastic today. Thank you for these. I will be feeding them back to Saeed so he sees them and he can get in touch if he wishes to. I would remind you that we have, as ever, a few fascinating things coming up. On Tuesday, we will be looking at employee share options in a new way with Vincent Mason. We have an unusual event on Tuesday when Ian Harris will be presenting tennis around the time of Sir Thomas Gresham. This is real tennis, and for those of you who are not aware, Sir Thomas Gresham is a bit of a hero, of a form anyway, amongst us in the FS Club. We'll be looking at hostile profiling with Michael Hoddy and Technium Global, and finally a focus on Lab1. Now, Lab1 is particularly interesting because it too is an Islamic center, and it's made huge goals, which we'll be hearing about, on how can finance internationally help to achieve the sustainable development goals. That's been a big focus there in Lab1, and we look forward to learning from them out there. But finally, of course, the real thanks today are to you, Saeed. You put so much work into clarifying things and making it so easy for us to understand. In these days of COVID, I wish I could open up the floodgates and show you things, but I have here a slightly religious thing. This is my from the temple of Bulgaksa in Korea. This is my Korean karmic clapper, and so if I may, I will try and channel the audience. And thank you so much for today, and we really hope to stay in touch with you.
Thank you. God bless. Thank you so much.